Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome. Thank you guys for coming into the Fermentation and Gut Health workshop with Allegheny Mountain Insitute, partnered with Augusta Health. We are an educational nonprofit working to cultivate healthy communities through food and education. We strive to meet our mission through a three-pronged approach, which includes an 18-month tuition-free farm and food system fellowship, institutional support for schools and hospitals, and regional networking to build food systems that nourish our bodies, environment, and our economy. I'm Sarah Spinner. I'm a community fellow. I'll be facilitating this workshop. And I'd like to remind you this workshop is being recorded and being posted to our YouTube channel, so you guys can come back and reference it at any time. Feel free to also turn your video off, although you aren't being recorded right now. Everyone is also currently on mute, so if you have any questions, please utilize the chat box. I'll be trying to monitor it throughout, but we will have time at the end dedicated to answering as many questions as we can. And before we get going, we have a bit of an overview. So we're going to go through what is the microbiome, gut health and fermentation, and research updates with Dr. Srivastava and Dr. Tennyson, and then fermentation basics and how to ferment, and hopefully try and get a demonstration done with Pat. So we're going to go through and just quickly do an introduction with everyone who's going to be speaking today, just so you know who's talking and know who they are. So Savita, if you would like to start with the introductions, then we'll move to Christina and then to Pat.
Hi, everyone. My name is Dr. Savita Srivastava. I'm one of the gastroenterologists at Augusta Health in Fishersville, Virginia. I guess I'd like to thank Sarah Spinner, Pat Banks, and the Allegheny Mountain Institute for inviting me to participate in tonight's workshop. It's a unique workshop on fermentation, so I'm really, really excited. As a GI doctor with a strong interest and a passion for bringing ancient healing practices to our modern everyday practice of medicine, I'm so proud of our connection to the farm with Sarah and Pat. I think it's pretty amazing that as doctors, we've got a farm on campus. We've got this amazing food pharmacy run by the Allegheny Mountain Institute for our patients with chronic disease. And we've just got amazing opportunities for collaboration on gut health between GI doctors and farmers. So it's a really unique experience. So thank you for inviting me.
And hi, everyone. I'm Dr. Christina Tennyson. I'm also a gastroenterologist at Augusta Health. I work with Dr. Srivastava, and we are both so excited to be here with the Allegheny Mountain Institute with Sarah and Pat. So thanks so much. And I'm excited that we'll have this as a resource to direct our patients to, and also share it with people outside Fishersville. So thanks again for collaborating with us, and looking forward to today. I think it's a lot of fun.
Hi everyone, I'm Pat Banks. I manage the Allegheny Mountain Institute farm at Augusta Health, and I'm an avid fermenter and big believer in the gut health and the connection between gut, mind, and all healthy things. I feel like every time we do a class like this, Christina and Dr. Srivastava give plenty of shout outs to me and Sarah, but we just want to shout out to them. They are doing wonderful work, and we've enjoyed working with them ever since they've started here. So we're excited to get going here.
Okay, we'll go ahead and get started with Savita.
This is what happens when you're like a freshman with Zoom. So this is like the first part of the workshop, and I've already screwed it up. So I'm going to lay the groundwork for understanding why fermented foods are tremendously important for gut health. Let's start just with basics first. A fermented food is defined as a new food that's created through this controlled growth of microorganisms. So when we talk about fermentation, it's actually defined as a process whereby microbes are going to break down components like sugars into organic acids, and that creates a new food. It has a different texture, a different taste, a different storage capacity, and incredible nutrient density that we may not have had in that original food. So I've got a nice illustration on the slide that shows that a chemical reaction is basically occurring between a sugar and a microbe, and that creates an organic acid, and that further leads to new foods being developed like cheeses, yogurt, sourdough bread, pickles, kimchi, and soy sauce. Next slide, please. So fermentation with a microbe called lactobacillus is called lactofermentation, and it leads to creation of a wide variety of foods that we see pretty typically in our American diet. You can see from the slide that a substrate like milk, cucumber, cabbage, or soybean is inoculated with lactobacillus, and that ultimately leads to creation of a new fermented food like yogurt, buttermilk, cheddar cheese, pickles, sauerkraut, kimchi, and soy sauce, things that we're pretty familiar with in American culture, but things that have actually been brought to us by a diversity of different cultures around the world. So lactic acid producing bacteria, interestingly, are also the starter microbes for things like sourdough bread, which includes yeast and acetic acid microbes in addition to lactobacillus. So you can see how we can create these cocktail of microbes that basically give us all sorts of different foods and textures and things that we can enjoy. And a lot of the diversity that we see in the foods and the different cultures that we get to experience oftentimes are very much a part of why fermented foods are such an important part of the enjoyment of food. Next slide. So fermentation, I'm going to say, is really neat because it's an ancient practice. It's been rediscovered in recent times by modern medicine. So when you think about it, fermentation is really an ancient food preservation technique, and it's sustained us for thousands of years. But in modern times, fermented foods with live microbes have become important for introducing new bacteria into the gut and increasing diversity of the gut microbiome that we're going to talk about during today's presentation. So you can see we've kind of flipped our relationship with microbes, right? In the last 10 years or so. I think even 20 years ago, we were kind of obsessed with microbes being germs that would cause infection or disease. Everything was antibacterial, everything was a hand sanitizer. But now we're seeing tremendous benefit in introducing these good gut microbes into our gut so that we can ultimately optimize our gut health. Next slide. So in case you haven't heard, your gut is chock full of healthy microbes called the gut microbiome. So the microbiome is defined as all of these organisms that live basically in and on our bodies. We know from the Human Microbiome Project, which is this large project that studies the gut microbiome, that there's about 100 trillion organisms that live in our gut alone. So in many ways, we're kind of part bacteria, part human, or some people say we're kind of like a superhuman organism with trillions of life forms that live in and on it. We know that we're learning a lot about the gut microbiome in recent times, and there's lots to learn. But we know that it's also extremely important in preserving our health, our wellness, and actually alterations may actually pose risk for disease. We know that GI diseases like Crohn's disease, obesity, heart disease, diabetes, food allergies, asthma, autoimmune disease, and even mood disorders like depression have some linkage to the gut microbiome. A few weeks ago, Christina and I got to participate in the microbiome of the soil presentation through the Allegheny Mountain Insitute, and we really went into the weeds of the gut microbiome. So for those of you who missed it, I really would encourage you to tune into the AMI channel for a lot of interesting facts that we presented on the gut microbiome, because I think we were quite vast in our introduction of the gut microbiome. But for today's presentation, I really want Pat to get his moment in time, so I don't want to steal all of it today. So next slide. So what are the functions of the gut microbiome? I'm going to say that we're unraveling at the speed of light just how essential our microbes are to our health and wellness, and actually even to our survival. I could spend hours, like I said, describing all these unique functions of the gut microbiome, but we would be here for hours and hours. So I'm just going to kind of break it down into a few important core structural functions that we associate with the microbiome. We know that it's extremely important in assisting with digestion and biosynthesis of amino acids and vitamins. It's very important for strengthening our immune system. It actually protects us against pathogens. So if you've got lots of good gut bacteria, those good bacteria are actually going to protect you against overgrowth of bad bacteria. The gut microbiome talks to the brain, so there's a huge connection between the brain-gut axis and the microbiome that orchestrates that conversation. And then ultimately, the microbiome is extremely important in metabolism, and it helps with weight control. So you can see its influence is quite vast, and each of those pieces that I've introduced could probably be a talk in of itself, because there's such an interesting connection between the microbiome and absolutely every aspect of our function beyond just the gut itself. Next slide. So how do we identify a healthy gut microbiome? I think the bottom line answer in 2021 is that we're not really sure. At this stage in our scientific discovery, we're kind of like on the Galapagos Islands, like Darwin, cataloging all the numbers and types of species of microbes in the gut microbiome. So we're learning new and more interesting things on a daily basis, but certainly we haven't learned everything that we need to learn. But one of the most important concepts that we've learned from scientific research is that microbial diversity seems to be one of the major factors that influences our risk for chronic disease like diabetes or heart disease or autoimmune disease or obesity. So microbial diversity is really, really important. Next slide. So since we've laid some basic foundations on how important it is to have a diverse gut microbiome, it is quite logical that fermented foods are actually going to help to promote growth of the microbiome and also diversity of the gut microbiome. We can essentially seed or inoculate our microbiome through eating fermented foods. So over the next few slides, I'm going to make the case that fermented foods are a perfect food for the gut microbiome. Fermented foods are unique because it contains 3 important components that we're going to talk more about in the following slides, but it's got prebiotics, probiotics, and postbiotics. So I know that Pat's going to focus on sauerkraut as something that we're going to produce today or learn how to make. And the sauerkraut is what I think a perfect food for the gut microbiome because it contains the pro, the pre, and the post. And we're going to get into the weeds of that in the next few slides. Let's break that down further. Next slide, please. All right, so the first thing we're going to talk about are probiotics. So probiotics are defined by the World Health Organization as live microorganisms that provide health benefit when consumed, generally by improving or restoring the gut flora. I think the quintessential example of probiotic foods are things that are fermented. So we've got these superfoods like yogurt and kefir and sauerkraut and tempeh and pickles and soy sauce and so many other amazing foods throughout many different cultures. And those are quintessentially probiotic foods because they contain a chock full of healthy gut microbes. Next slide, please. So then you get into prebiotics. So prebiotics are foods that are typically high fiber foods that act as food. They feed the gut microbiome. When you think about it, it's important to recognize that we eat the standard American diet that's really high in protein or fat. So we've tailored all these new types of diets in modern times that are focused on low carbohydrates, high protein, or high fats. And we have to understand that when we think about digestion absorption, fats and proteins are digested pretty high up in our digestive system called the small intestine. But most of our gut microbes live all the way at the bottom of our digestive system called the colon or the large intestine. So when we eat diets that are high in fats or proteins, we're essentially starving out our good gut bacteria and not feeding them very well. And that's where prebiotics come in. So they're a food for the gut microbiome. And it's important to recognize that fibrous foods don't get digested in the human body further up. And so they're the perfect substrate for feeding our microbes well. Some examples of prebiotic foods are listed on this slide. I think dandelion greens, garlic, onions, chicory root, Jerusalem artichokes, green bananas, whole oats, and apples are common prebiotic foods that a lot of integrative and functional medicine doctors like to talk about when we talk about really making our gut microbiome robust. So of course, for the purposes of, again, sauerkraut and what we're going to create during our presentations, cabbage is also a great prebiotic food. So now you've got cabbage, which is a substrate for creating sauerkraut. So you're inoculating with microbes the cabbage. And now you've got these microbes that are also feeding off of the cabbage. And now we get to eat the cabbage the sauerkraut. And now we're ingesting a food that's not only a probiotic, but also a prebiotic. So you can see how you're creating these combination of foods that are providing extreme nutritional value for our gut microbes. So we're inoculating microbes, but we're also feeding them very well. Next slide. Lastly, we're going to talk about postbiotics. I'm going to say postbiotics are like this new buzzword in microbiome pop culture. Postbiotics is a new term. It's used to describe functional bioactive compounds that are generated during fermentation, and they basically promote our health. So basically the byproducts of combining a probiotic and a prebiotic is going to be a postbiotic. So this is what I call like the secret sauce. It contains vital compounds that are extremely important for anti-inflammation, and they promote the growth of our gut microbiome. Next slide. So this is a nice summary that kind of gives you a good explanation for why fermented foods are the perfect food for the gut. It's got the 3 Ps, the prebiotics, the probiotics, and the postbiotics. So now you're seeding your gut microbiome, you're providing your microbes with good prebiotic fiber, and then you're also ingesting beneficial byproducts of microbiome function. So you've got like a lot of different combinations of great things, the secret sauce, like I like to call it. Next slide. So, a new area of active scientific discovery is actually understanding some of the health benefits of fermented foods. And I think this is an area that Christina knows a lot about and is an expert in. I'm just going to briefly just provide a list of different things that, that pop up when we talk about the benefits of fermented foods. Things like increasing our healthy microbes, improving our digestion and absorption, improving our immune health, improving our mental health, and it may lower risk of obesity and heart disease. So all areas of active study. Fermented foods in general are a new area of research. And I think Dr. Tennyson is going to be providing a great overview for us in terms of what to expect from the research realm and what we're looking at in the future. Thank you so much.
Thanks for that great talk, Savita. So I'm going to transition us a little bit with about 3 things to talk about during this segment. Number 1, we're going to think about taking an inventory for what we're eating on a regular basis. And if you're a healthcare provider, if you're a physician, a nurse, a dietitian, these are things that I think we should also be thinking about for our patients. Number 2, I'm going to just quickly give a quick overview of some of the important aspects of what these fermented foods may be doing, and the challenge that we're basically all facing when we're eating a standard American diet. As Dr. Srivastava said, the SAD or standard American diet is kind of a challenge for all of us. And then the third thing is I really want to go into some fascinating research that was just published a couple of months ago that I think is really at the forefront of what the studies that we're going to see going forward in the future. So first things first, number 1, take an inventory. So I usually like to tell people, think about what you eat in a typical week. What do you buy when you go grocery shopping? And think about what's a typical workday diet look like for you? What do you eat on a typical workday? And then what do you eat on a weekend? Because some of us vary when we're at work or when we're at home. And think about not only how many fruits and vegetables you eat on a standard day, and you'll hear in the microbiome research that 30 seems to be one of the magic numbers, that people who eat over 30 plants per week have a more diverse microbiome. But I want us to do the 2.0 or kind of the advanced version and think to yourself, how many fermented foods do you eat on a typical day or week? So how often do you eat them, and then how much? And a lot of times for many of us, when we go grocery shopping, we tend to buy the same things. So we eat things that we like, and we may just put our own diets and our family's diets on repeat because we know what our kids like, we know what we like. But just try to think kind of next level and think about these types of foods. How often do you eat fermented foods? How often and how much? Next slide, please. And as Dr. Srivastava said, these fermented foods are found worldwide in different cultures across the world. So if we're eating different types of ethnic foods, you may be exposed to it, but if you're going grocery shopping at your standard market, you may not be. Next slide, please. And there are different types, and Pat will get into some of the specifics of the different fermentation products with sauerkraut, but I wanted to just give a broad overview. Again, some of these, we had some nice pictures. Kefir is a fermented milk beverage, and a lot of the research has focused on this in the past. So again, there may be different funding sources of research. We're also going to not talk about today yogurt and cheese. Sauerkraut as a fermented cabbage. Kombucha, that was originally from China, as a fermented tea beverage. And tempeh is a fermented food from boiled or hulled soybeans, and that was originated from Indonesia. Natto is fermented soybean. Miso is a fermented soybean paste from Japan. Kimchi, fermented vegetables from Korea, and then sourdough. And some of these different fermented products may differ whether it's a spontaneous fermentation. So things like sauerkraut, it's spontaneous. We may not be adding anything to it. And things like kefir that are actually inoculated and we're giving a starter culture. So those are things like kefir grains. And I just wanted to mention that if you are a vegetarian, if you're vegan, or if you're an omnivore, there are different options of products available. There are non-dairy fermented kefir, and some of those are fermented with water. So it's not the same thing as a milk beverage, and that really hasn't been studied as much in the literature. Next slide, please. And the interesting thing is that it's kind of like a competition. So it's a little microcosm of what's going on in these products, that there are different types of bacteria and yeast that are present. And what may be present at one stage may be different from what's present later. So there are things like lactobacillus, there are bifidobacterium, there's Saccharomyces, there's yeast. So there's many different products that are in these fermented products. Next slide, please. And how could they benefit us? So as Savita mentioned, they may contain prebiotic organisms, and these organisms may compete against pathogenic bacteria that could be present in our gut. We also may get, as she mentioned earlier, these metabolites, so these active compounds that may have a beneficial effect on our own health system. Prebiotics, and then they may convert compounds to active metabolites. So things like flavonoids may be more active when we're eating fermented foods. And then another interesting thing is that they may help reduce certain things that we can't digest. So you may hear of something called FODMAPs, which are fermentable carbohydrates, that some of these fermented foods may actually decrease, as well as decreasing some other things called anti-nutrients that may be present in certain types of food. Next slide, please. So the take-home point, I think, unfortunately, is that at this point, we're kind of in the beginning of putting these pieces of the puzzle together. And there really is very limited evidence for most of these fermented foods for overall GI health. And I think that's going to change in the next couple of years. And I'm going to talk to you about this new area of research that I think is really exciting. But as of now, there really haven't been very large human trials showing a benefit. But there are benefits that have been seen in lab experiments. That's sometimes you'll hear the phrase in vitro, as well as animal models, particularly mouse models. And the other thing that is difficult is that it's hard to study these products because there's many different cultures that are out there. There's many different products. So making something standardized that we can apply to large groups of people is a little bit difficult. Next slide, please. But that being said, going back to one of the earlier slides that we had here is that we know diversity in nature is important. So, as a reminder, this is a beautiful coral reef, a beautiful forest, a lovely puffin or important seabirds, that we know that diversity in nature is important and everything is interconnected. And when we don't have diversity, there are potentially bad outcomes. Next slide, please. So one thing that we do know that we're all struggling with is that there does appear to be reduced diversity of the gut microbiome in Western populations. So in industrialized populations, we're actually losing the diversity of our gut microbiome. And at the same time, we're actually having more diseases. So more autoimmune disease, more chronic diseases, things like obesity and allergy. Next slide, please. And when we go to our friends, the mice, as far as mouse studies, there is some indication in the literature that we can apply these to human populations, and that's kind of just being worked out. So about 6 years ago, there was a viral video of a mouse walking up a New York City subway holding a slice of pizza. And that kind of reminds me of what, this is a study that was published in Nature by the Sonnenbergs. And what they actually did is they looked at these microbiota accessible carbohydrates that are present in fiber, and that really shapes the microbiome of the mouse. And what they found is that mice that were given a low fiber Western style diet actually had a loss of diversity in the microbiota. And they seemed that if they did replace the mouse diet with more fiber, it seemed that it was reversible, that they could gain back more diversity. But if it existed for several generations, even when they gave the mice more fiber, they couldn't return to that increased diversity that they had before. So it seems that this is connected, that if we eat a diet that's high in fiber, we're supporting our microbiota or the bacteria that live in our gut. But if we don't eat a diet high in fiber, then we're going to have some loss of that diversity, and that may lead to these worse health outcomes. Next slide, please. So we have to remember that fiber is found in plant foods. So fruits and vegetables, as well as seeds, legumes, and other products that are based in plants. That's how we get our fiber. So our standard American diet, we're actually not eating enough fiber as we should. So we're faced with a loss of diversity because we're not feeding the microbiota. And that's the challenge, is how do we kind of repopulate or recultivate our own microbiome? And this is this area of research that I was saying that I think is really exciting. Next slide, please. So a new study came out just about 6 months ago, and this was from a group of well-known researchers, the Sonnenbergs at Stanford, with Christopher Gardner, who's a nutrition science guru. And basically what they found is they looked at healthy volunteers, and they found that fermented foods actually increase the diversity of the gut microbiome. So this gives us a way to cultivate our own microbiome by increasing the amount of products that we eat. And it also decreased inflammatory markers and signaling. So it kind of acts on both levels. And this was independent of fiber. Next slide, please. So in this study, they had about 36 healthy volunteers, and they gave half of the volunteers a high fiber diet. Their baseline was, it was about 25 grams of fiber when they started, and they had increased during that study to over 40 grams of fiber per day. And then they gave an equal amount of group a diet high in fermented foods. So the interesting part about this study, again, is that the fermented food group had less activation of their immune cells. They had decreased inflammatory proteins, and they had an increase in diversity of their microbiome. And it seemed that the effect was greater when they ate larger amounts of fermented foods. So one of the critiques of this study is that the people in this group were very motivated, and they went from eating less than 1 fermented food per day to over 6. In this study, they actually controlled for fiber. So people who ate more fermented foods did not increase their fiber intake. A lot of the fermented foods that they ate were based in milk and animal products. So they actually increased that, but so they kept their fiber even. But it seemed like eating fermented foods did help. Next slide, please. So if we go back to your own inventory and think again, what are the fermented foods that you eat? What kind of foods do you like? What kind of foods does your family like? And we know that eating these fermented foods actually changes the flavor of certain foods, and they're very tasty, they're delicious. Just think, how often could you do it and how much? And one of the side effects that I didn't mention is that some people initially in the study had symptoms with bloating. And it seemed after the period of the study that actually had decreased. So if you start eating some fermented foods, you may experience some more gas and bloating. So start small, and you can slowly increase it and see how you do. And with that, I'll pass it off to Pat.
Alrighty. Thanks, Christina and Savita. Yeah, you might see a bit of overlap in what they talked about, but it all kind of ties together, and I think we'll work out great here. Anyway, welcome to the Fermentation Basics side of things. Has anyone eaten any ferments today? Many things are fermented, in our daily diets. Most things, however, are not raw anymore, raw ferments, but such things as chocolate, coffee, wine, yogurt, cheese. Most of those products are fermented, and they have been forever. So next slide, Sarah. So why should you ferment your food outside of the health benefits? I guess for ever since as far back as we go, it's been used for storage until refrigeration, really, especially here in the US. But storage is the main one they still use today. Once you ferment your product out, your vegetables or your fruits, you can store them in like a root cellar or under the ground, or honestly, and also in rivers or streams that they have used in ancient practices. And that the cool storage, once the bacteria does its work, it allows, one sec, I'm going to close my chat here. How do I do that? Also a Zoom beginner here. But yeah, what you're aiming for when you ferment your product out, especially vegetables and fruits, is that you're looking for cool storage to slow down that ferment. Because if it keeps fermenting, things will start to go awry. Taste, things that are fermented, in my opinion, are definitely taste a lot better. And there's also just a further connection to the produce, which with our modern American diets, we have gotten, in my opinion, very far away from the connection of our food. So by fermenting your foods, chopping it up, cooking, I believe is you're creating a bigger connection to where your produce and where your produce comes from. And as Savita and Christina talked about, the nutrient enhancement that comes with fermenting foods. All right, next slide, Sarah. All right, so what is fermentation? It comes from the Latin word febrere. Sorry for pronunciation, but that it means to boil. Myth has it that upon seeing vats of grapes spontaneously bubble in ancient Roman times, that they were amazed at creating wine, and they thought they were cooking, boiling. So that's where the term ferment came from. And still used, as I mentioned before, it's still used to preserve vegetables today. You'll see in this picture that Sarah, in the slide, this is an underground vat of clay crocks that is used to make wine in Georgia. But at its most basic definition, fermentation is the transformation of food by microorganisms, whether it be bacteria, yeast, or mold. We're going to touch on a few of those coming up here. So next slide. Two main types we're going to talk about. I'm just going to touch on one, and we're going to rest of the class and be focused on the other. There are many different types of fermentations involving many bacteria, yeast, and fungi. I'm just going to touch on a few, probably the most common. Alcoholic fermentation. So this is obviously your beer, your wine, any alcohol you can think of is fermented. This also includes kombucha and vinegars. The main players in these ferments are Saccharomyces cerevisiae, and Christina mentioned that a bit ago. This is a yeast that is all around us, in the air everywhere. It's responsible for humanity's most important culinary pillars, they call it, which is bread, beer, and wine. So it's Saccharomyces cerevisiae is a fungi that it consumes sugar to convert into alcohol. And then the other factor that is in play here is another bacteria. This is a bacteria called acetic acid bacteria. This bacteria, once converted to alcohol, will come in and convert the sugars or the alcohol into acid. So if you think when you open a bottle of wine and you're drinking your wine, and you leave your bottle open or your wine glass out for a few days, if it starts that off taste, that vinegary taste, that's the acetic acid bacteria converting the alcohol into acid. So that's all vinegars are made today. The other main act of fermentation, which is the one we'll be talking about today, it's the most common bacteria. It's called most common fermentation called lactate fermentation. It's used in it's a lactic acid bacteria is the grand scope of the bacteria. And the most common strain of that is lactobacillus, which was also mentioned earlier. The term lacto-fermented, it's very commonly used in the world, or in the world of fermentation, you hear it thrown around. It's sometimes confused that it's not actually yogurt, or it's not like, there's no lactase in it. It's just it's the strand, the lactobacillus. That's the strand of fermentation that's happening. So it's not correlated with like dairy products. It's used to ferment pickles, sauerkraut, yogurt, milk, cheese. There's a lot of different strands of the lactic acid bacteria that do those, but that's just a general idea. All vegetables and fruits typically have these lactic acid bacteria on them. That's why, if you can, buying growing or buying locally organic produce is a big benefit to this, because other harmful chemicals may be on those vegetables to inhibit lactic acid bacteria. Yeah, and lactic acid, the idea is that the LABs, lactic acid bacteria, come in, they add a fruitiness and acidity and umami, just about anything you can think of, whether it be vegetables, any kind of fruit. One of the only ones that I know of is that onions are the only group of vegetables that they don't have their own lactic acid bacteria on there, but you still can ferment them, and we'll talk about that in a bit. Yeah. LABs, or lactic acid bacteria, they're anaerobic, so they survive without oxygen, and we're going to get into why that's important in a second. And they're also halo intolerant, which means they can survive in a salt dominant environment. The idea is, I'm going to say this a few times throughout here, we're trying to build the good bacteria by keeping the bad bacteria out. Next slide. So I have a few rules of my own. So whenever you're fermenting anything, just trust your nose and your gut. Don't be afraid to, if it doesn't smell right or feel right, just throw it out, or compost it. You're better off going that route than not. Experiment. I'm going to give you a few recipes and a few things that I like to do and tips and tricks, but the world of fermentation is endless. I feel like I've just touched the very tip of the iceberg of it. Yeah, there's just so many different areas and so many things you can ferment, but yeah, experimenting has been a very fun for me, and it's a very unique thing to do. So, and taste along the way. Once you make your ferment, taste it after a few days of fermenting. If you like it, then you can stop fermenting. There's no written rule of how long you should ferment something. I'll give you a general idea of what I do, but if you like something, if you like this it goes along with experiments. If you like something, taste it, and put it in the fridge. So, all right, next slide. All right, just a brief note on sanitation. Make sure all your vessels, cutting board, knives, mason jars, anything you're going to be using is properly sanitized and washed before beginning, including your hands. Make sure your veggies are clean and peeled. You don't want to allow dirt in there if you're like, say you're harvesting from your garden. Again, object is to keep the good bacteria in, bad bacteria out. Bad bacteria is going to live on unclean surfaces, dirt, stuff like that. So. All right, so we're going to talk about two types of ferments today. One's going to be your basic pickled vegetable ferments. This is called a salt brine ferment. Pickles typically get I think of a pickle, I think of a cucumber in a vinegar-based brine. You can actually pickle just about any vegetable you want to. Cucumbers, carrots, radishes, garlic, anything you really think of, you can pickle. And what we're going to be pickling today is carrots and kohlrabi, if you're familiar with those two vegetables. But first, you'll need a container. So a mason jar or a crock, which is picture the two pictures there. A crock is right above the mason jars. You'll need a knife and a cutting board. Salt, it's best to use natural sea salt. Avoid iodine. The iodine can inhibit your lactic acid bacteria. It's still, I have fermented with iodized salt before, but if you can avoid it, you should. You'll need a weight to hold down your brine. So part of it, we're trying to keep our brine above our vegetables throughout the whole process. So, and then you'll need filtered water. Okay. So yeah, I'll briefly go through the steps to make sure everything's clean. Chop your vegetables of choice. I'm just gonna kind of do one. I have everything pre-chopped, so we're gonna kind of try to do. I don't know, Sarah, if you can toggle me into view. Let's see if that works quick.
Yeah, I'm gonna go ahead and stop sharing my screen so everyone can see him a little bit bigger, and then I'll restart it. So bear with us when we're doing that.
All right, am I on?
Yes, if everyone wants to click on speaker view, that'll be the easiest way to be able to see Pat.
Cool. I'm just going to start and let us know if you're having a problem with that. So, I pre-chopped some carrots and kohlrabi into little cubes. That's what you want. It's all kind of dependent on what you're looking to do. If you want to what you want to make. You want to make a little, I like to do cubes. You can do elongated, cuts. It doesn't really matter in the ferment process. You can cut it any way you want. Then next thing you want to do is you want to add your salt. So the standard is you're looking for 2% salt to vegetable weight ratio. So if I were to do it that way, I would have weighed out my kohlrabi, my carrots, and I would have taken that weight in grams on a scale and then times that by that weight by 2%. So, however, I do it differently. It's my rule of thumb is 1 tablespoon per quart of vegetables. It's usually a little saltier, but I like my ferments a little saltier. So you're going to add your salt after you have everything chopped. Just going to do that. So it's a pretty very simple. This can take 5-10 minutes. So then you want to, after you add your salt, you're going to want to add your water, which I'll do. So if you can see my camera, I have a floating vegetables in water and salt. You can, at this point, you can use what they call back slopping. And this is where you use if you have a ferment that you've done, say I made pickles last week and I ate them all throughout the week and I wanted to make another batch. I would use the brine, a little bit of brine, probably a couple tablespoons to put into my new ferment, just to kind of introduce the lactic acid bacteria that's going to help get things going. So cool. And then you're going to want to add your weight at this point. So just a few notes on weights. Essentially, you're trying to weigh this down. So let's see, this is going to be I'm going to break my computer. You're trying to make sure your vegetables stay below in your brine weight. So if they float to the top, you're going to introduce those vegetables to oxygen, which is going to create problems with mold. So to keep an anaerobic environment, you want to create a weight to help your vegetables maintain a proper fermentation. There are many ways to do this. There's vegetable scraps you can use. I took some cabbage leaves from the kraut that we're going to make in a second. You can use these cabbage leaves. I'm going to make a mess, I think. See how I have that cabbage leaf stuck in there? And that water is right on top of that cabbage leaf. So that weight is enough to hold that vegetables down. There's a few other things you can do. You can use a plastic bag. I don't recommend using plastic. It just seems, I don't know, a little weird to me to be fermenting with plastic, but I have done it in the past with things that are like more fine. Like I've made, if you get into fermentation looking at like hot sauce and stuff like that, you need a surface. So you can fill a plastic bag like Ziploc with water and put it on top of your ferment, and that'll hold down fine as well. Also plastic lids. However, don't use anything metal, only glass, clay, rock. Metal's it's an acidic environment, so it's gonna rust and it's gonna ruin your ferment, and you're not gonna want to eat yet. Do not use metal. So cool. So after you have your ferment weighted down properly, you want to cover it. You have two options. You can cover it with a mason jar lid, like that, or you can use a cloth and put a rubber band around it, like that. There's benefits to both. This one, you're limiting more oxygen with the lid. However, you have to burp it, what they call burp it, every morning and night. So as your ferment goes, so you set this on the counter for 5 to 7 days, and it's going to start creating CO2, and you're going to need to release that CO2 from your container, the buildup. So what they call is burping it. It's simply just cracking it, opening it for a second, and closing it. That's all you need to do twice a day. I like being very hands-on with my ferments. I enjoy seeing what's happening inside the jar and hearing it kind of bubble. It's just really unique to me and fun. But if you're not that person, putting a clean cloth over your jar and tying a rubber band to it, it's just fine. That CO2 is then just releasing into the air, and you'll just have to check on it, whenever you can, every other day. So the ideal, in my mind, the ideal is let it sit on the counter for 7 to 10 days. Like in between 70 and 75 degrees is the most common, is a recommended or ideal ferment temperature. So after that, like I said, taste your ferment as long as you go. And if you enjoy your ferment, put it in the fridge or or cool space, and you can enjoy it then. So I like to add a lot of herbs and stuff like that to it as well. Cool. I don't know if you can pull the slides back up, Sarah. And then the next slide is going to be our basic sauerkraut recipe. Pretty much the same. I don't know if we still have the pickles. It's pretty much the same idea as using these pickles, except you're creating a brine for the sauerkraut. You're massaging it. You're breaking down essentially the sauerkraut cell walls, and it's releasing a brine itself. And that's the only difference between the dry brine and the salt brine, is that we're creating a salt brine with to ferment like the pickles for like cabbage and for sauerkraut and kimchi and stuff like that. You're trying to create its own brine from the from the vegetable. So yeah, so kind of same thing. Knife, cutting board, cabbage, salt, weight. Make sure everything's clean. You're gonna want to core and chop your vegetables, or you want to core and shred your cabbage. And we should, yeah, sorry, Sarah, can you flip me back on? Sorry, everybody. Thanks for dealing with us during this weird time, trying to do a little demonstration here. You can do, and the thing is with the pickles as well. So I know you saw I had carrots and kohlrabi in this pickle. You can also shred these. You can make your own salt brine with different vegetables too. So like pickles or carrots and kohlrabi, they also make their own brine if you shred them with like a vegetable spreader or like a shredder. Anyway, so you got your core, your cabbage. So you took the core out, then you chop and shred your cabbage to your desired size. I prefer like a pretty pencil width cabbage in long strands. So it's kind of like that. And that's what I prefer to eat. Again, it's going back to, if you want to make it thinner and like not as long, it's up to your preference. But after you have your cabbage chopped, you're gonna want to put it in a bowl. Let me see here. You want to put it in a bowl, said bowl. Then you want to massage it. So I'm going to try to do this. So what you want to do is you just want to get in there and just start massaging your cabbage down. And you're going to start feeling it start to break down and become more loose. That's a good sign that you'll notice a brine forming, a cabbage getting wet. This is when you want to start adding your salt. The salt's going to help break it down even further and start drawing out the water out of the cabbage. Again, going back to when to add salt, it's 2% by weight is recommended. I like to do it by taste though, as well. So like taste as you go. I prefer my cabbage, my sauerkraut a little bit saltier than to taste. Like, so if I'm tasting it, just a little bit saltier. So if you keep going, you'll see the brine start to form. I don't know if this is gonna be good or not, but you can squeeze it and you'll see it kind of start to juice out. That's when you know your sauerkraut's sauerkraut's ready to go. So once you get to that point, you want to take a mason jar. You want to pack your sauerkraut. In there, and you want to you don't want to just throw it in, you want to pack it in. So it's very kind of just sitting in there right now. I'm gonna pack it down here. Whoops. So see a difference? I've kind of packed it down to half size. All right. You fill that up. And then once you get your jar all filled, you want to take the excess brine from your kraut and dump that on top of it. So you have a nice, good brine. If you get your sauerkraut packed in, again, I like to take the extra leaves from my cabbage and put it on top as a weight to keep that sauerkraut down. And at this point, you can either put a lid on it, again, going back to our pickles, or you can use a cloth. But one thing with sauerkraut is this is going to continue to draw water out of your cabbage. So when you put it on your counter, make sure you have a bowl or something underneath where it can catch the brine, or else you're gonna have a big mess in your kitchen. And then, then you just put a lid on it, burp it every day, or you put a weight on it and a cloth over it. About 7 to 10 days I recommend that's my general recommendation for most ferments, but some things are a little more difficult than others. So just kind of if you're looking to get really good like cucumbers, that's probably the most difficult one. Just have to do some research on when the best time is for them. So, cool. All right, back to the slides. Then I just want to touch on a little bit of troubleshooting. We can take some questions at the end. A few problems that I've encountered common encounters are the brine becoming too cloudy. So that pickle brine it starts out very clear. Like right now, it's super clear. It looks just like water, but in 3, 4, 5 days, it's going to start getting like a cloudy appearance. This is okay. This is your bacteria at work, and actually, it's a good sign. That's what I take as a sign for my ferments to be done. There's a white film that can form on your ferments. It kind of looks like it's like bubbly, and it's called com yeast. So it's not harmful at all. You can scrape it off. This is usually due to the presence of too much oxygen. I would, with all these though, make sure we properly identify before consuming or IDing any of that, or before moving forward. Slimy or mushy vegetables, also a very common problem I've encountered. This is typically caused by it just being too hot. Without a controlled like AC or heat, your ferments, if it's too hot, it's going to get very mushy and ferment very fast. So if you don't have a controlled environment, you're going to want to watch your ferments closely, because they're going to ferment very fast. And if you live in a cool environment, then that's a reason why if it's not fermenting, it doesn't seem like it's working at all. It's too cool. That's down at the bottom. If mold forms, it depends on the outbreak, but you can just scrape off, like on the sauerkraut brine, you can just scrape off the ferments down, like just scrape off around the area and the mold or anything that it's touched, and it's still going to be good below that. However, I don't highly recommend that. I'd probably just throw that batch out. But it is said that you can scrape that off. So, and like I said, when in doubt, throw it out, or compost it. So that's the end of my section. I have a few resources that the books I've thrown up that I really enjoy. Let us know if you have any questions.
Thanks, Pat. I think we have a few questions that came in, and I'll leave this resource page up so if you guys want to jot any of those down. And again, this will be all recorded so you can look at it again. But so someone asked, are there any concerns recommending fermented foods for hypertensive patients?
So there are actually some studies looking, a study was published in the American Journal of Cardiology, studying kimchi, that people who actually ate kimchi had lower risks of hypertension. And there's also that study that I mentioned that came out of Stanford recently. It was kind of interesting that as people ate more fermented products, and again, like I mentioned, some of those did include dairy products, but it seemed that the sodium intake actually had remained the same, which I thought was pretty interesting. And also I had run into a study out of Korea where they looked at about 6,000 patients, and it seemed that people who ate fermented products did not have an increased risk of hypertension. So I think with anything to be cautious, and just a reminder during this, we're not really giving medical advice, right? But just follow your blood pressure with your doctor. And I think a lot of people have home, blood pressure monitors too, that, if you don't have that, obviously see your doctor and just pay attention to it. But as of now, the literature says probably no. Savita, anything else you think to add about that?
Yeah, I think keeping in mind that there's a wide variety of fermented foods. So I think you're probably referring to the salted fermented vegetables, but certainly keep in mind that there are other things like kefir or fermented foods like yogurt, for example, that may not have the same salt concentration. I think that there's some proposed mechanisms along the lines of why we don't necessarily get worsening hypertension or a higher prevalence of hypertension in societies that eat a lot of fermented vegetables. Certainly, we have a lot of, like Dr. Tennyson mentioned, a lot of literature from the Asian countries that shows that we don't see more hypertension in that population. And I think one of the mechanisms potentially is that we do have more potassium in some of these fermented foods, and that potassium may basically dilute the effects of the high sodium. So it may just balance itself out.
Awesome. Thank you, guys. And then another question, what if you don't have back slop to put in? Does it start itself?
Yep, it will absolutely start itself. I think another benefit to backslopping as well, if you're looking to make the same product over and over again, like if you're trying to use a consistent recipe, that's going to help like inoculate those bacteria that for your next kind of pickle. But yes, it will ferment itself.
Okay, and then one more question just came through. Can you discuss the filtered water for the brine? Should it be distilled water instead of tap water?
I recommend if it's like city water, if it's treated water, yeah, I would either buy filter water if you have a water filter, or boil your water. Yeah, that's what I would recommend. So just trying to avoid any. You're trying to avoid have a clean environment, trying to avoid any chemical going into your veggies. So.
What about chlorine in the water? I've seen, yeah, that was something I wonder about. Do you need water that's chlorine free?
I have fermented products with like city water as well, but I've had a lot of products go bad due to that too. I would recommend, yeah, if you can unchlorinate your water or boil it again or filter it. I've had successes and failures both with it, but I've had a lot more successes with tap water or like a well water.
And can I ask you another question? Like, how hot is too hot? Because you mentioned heat. I had a very hot New York City apartment for a while, and I was kind of concerned that I would not be able to do this well. Is there like a right temperature?
Yep. So between 70 and 75 degrees is your ideal temperature. I've lived in hot places and fermented. It's just like your temperatures are going to vary. If you're looking for consistency, 70, 75 is going to be your longest. The hotter it is and the colder it is, it's going to like affect how quickly, because then your vegetables are sitting in there longer. Like if it's really cold as well, they're sitting in a salt brine, there's like that, those lactic acid bacteria are not acting. And if it's really, really hot, they're acting way too fast. So you're looking for like kind of a sweet spot. That being said, like, if it's like a 95 degree apartment, you can ferment. It's just going to take 7 to 10 days is going to be 2 to 3 days. And it might not be as it might just not be as tasteful, as it would be like on a longer ferment. But, I like to, like a tip that I do too with my pickles is I like to ferment for 7 to 10 days and leave it in the fridge for 7 to 10 days longer. And then that's when I usually get my best product. So.
Thanks, Pat. Someone just gave us a good tip that if you leave chlorinated water out to breathe, it should be good. That's what they do for pet fish, which is interesting. Didn't know that.
And Pat, can you just review your kind of tip again? So you said if it's a quart of vegetables, you use a tablespoon of salt. Yep. Do you mind just saying that again?
Yeah, I could type in the chat too. But yeah, so if a quart of pickled vegetables, like I did with the carrots and kohlrabi, I use a tablespoon of salt. With cabbage, I like to do it to taste, which is just a little tastier, a little saltier than what my palate likes, and that's just due to a preference. But again, if you're looking for like I'm not really a rule, like a recipe following person, but if you're that person, like 2% by weight on any vegetable you're fermenting or fruit is going to be the good place to start. So I can type that.
What's the most exotic thing you fermented, Pat?
One thing I really enjoy, I wouldn't call it very exotic, but I really enjoy fermenting. You make a garlic paste that you can put into any dish. It's essentially just making really like a garlic smoothie and fermenting it for a while. I really want to get into fermenting meats and like making my own miso, which is like kind of next, like I would call it like a next level of fermentation of, you create your own mold and you mold out like it's like long 6 months to a year of making your own miso, but and meat and like curing meats. That's all part of fermentation too, if you're into that. So that's kind of the new world for me.
It's really cool. And just if anyone's interested, Noma, the restaurant, the guide that Pat has here just won again, best restaurant in the world. It's in Denmark, Copenhagen. And they have really cool like how-to for kind of beginners and advanced people like Pat. But I thought that's a really great resource.
If you can see me, there's the book, one of my favorites. So.
Awesome. It looks like you already answered that question about the weight with the garlic paste. And we're getting a little past 6, so if no one else has any more questions, I think we'll be ending right now. I just want to thank you guys again so much for joining us. Again, I'll be sending out a follow-up email that'll have a link to our YouTube channel where you can see this again. It should hopefully be posted tomorrow. And also check out our website. We have other events and workshops, and you can also go there just to check out what we're doing and for donations. And yeah, thank you guys. Have a wonderful evening.